5 years of confinement changes a person. The world outside keeps moving, but inside, time stands still. The rhythm of everyday life, the weight of silence, the absence of choice. It all leaves a mark. I had counted every day, every hour, waiting for the moment I would finally breathe free air again. But now that the gates had opened, now that the walls no longer caged me, I wasn't sure what freedom even meant anymore. The gate slammed shut behind me, its bolt sliding into place. I glanced back at the high walls and heavy wooden gates that had confined me for 5 long years. I wasn't sure what to do next, but revenge was on my mind, though I didn't know exactly who I wanted to get back at. 7 years of prison was enough for anyone, and now I was free. I walked down the short road that led from the prison to the main street. A few people stood at a bus stop across the way, probably on their way to work. They likely saw prisoners being released every day, and I imagined they recognized me. As I reached the end of the road, a group of reporters started approaching. I wasn't surprised. They had been hounding me during my time in prison, and now they were ready to ambush me as I walked out. Just then, a car pulled up. A man got out and handed me the keys, saying I should leave immediately because the reporters were closing in. He told me there was cash, a phone, and my belongings in the trunk, and that someone named Ronnie was waiting for me at a cottage. He also suggested I call if I planned to spend the night anywhere else. I jumped into the car, drove off quickly, and did my best not to draw attention. I didn't want the police to notice me, but I needed to get away from those reporters fast. Once on the highway, I headed west, trying to stay alert in case anyone was following me. It didn't take long to spot a white car behind me. I knew it was a reporter tailing me. I turned into a rest stop to shake them off, hoping to intimidate the driver. The car followed me, but to my surprise, it stopped right behind. I got out and approached, only to find the driver was a woman. I tried to scare her off, but she wasn't frightened at all. I stormed off into the cafeteria, but to my surprise, she followed me in. She sat across from me and explained she wasn't a reporter. She was an insurance claims adjuster and said she could help me. Her father had worked in insurance and had been investigating my case. She told me that the company that insured Mary Simmons's life had paid out a policy after I was convicted, but her father had always suspected something was off, especially about the timing of the policy and the fact that William Simmons had canceled his own shortly after Mary's death. Her father had spent years keeping tabs on Simmons, trying to track down where all of Mary's money had gone. He had even looked into my case, convinced I was framed. When her father died, she picked up where he left off, trying to find Simmons, but he had vanished. I wasn't sure what to make of all this. She wanted me to talk about my case, but I wasn't ready yet. I needed time to think. I agreed to meet her again in a few days once I had sorted my thoughts. She gave me her contact information, thanked me, and left. After watching her go, I waited a little before getting back in my car and checking the road for anyone following me. I drove for about 60 miles before I was sure no one was tailing me. Then I took a side road heading home. When I reached the cottage, it was nearing 3 in the morning. The place had been arranged under a Bahamian company's name, courtesy of Ronnie McIntosh, my lawyer, occasional fixer, and closest friend. Technically, I was renting it, but in reality, it was just a layer of protection to keep certain financial interests safe from my ex-wife's reach. Ronnie had handled everything: car, money, a safe place to land after my release. He had always been the one to make sure Angela's greed didn't touch my offshore assets. The moment I stepped inside, he was waiting. He wasn't happy. I had taken longer than expected, making sure I hadn't been followed. Some woman, an insurance investigator named Helen Caffrey, had been on my tail, digging into the payout from Mary Simmons' death. The name rang a bell for Ronnie. He flipped through a folder with my name on it, pulling out old notes. It wasn't Helen he recognized, but her father, George Caffrey. When I was first imprisoned, the man had tried several times to meet with me, and I had refused every time. More recently, his daughter had come knocking. Ronnie had turned her away too. She had theories, ones that pointed to Bill Simmons and possibly her own father as suspects in Mary's murder. But Ronnie dismissed it. The police had already ruled Simmons out early in the investigation. His alibi had been airtight, leaving me as their convenient target. That part still stung. A wealthy woman was murdered in a luxury hotel. Days later, the police had me in handcuffs. A high-profile case, a quick conviction. It made careers. I had been an easy win for them, but for now, none of that mattered. What mattered was my kids. I wanted to see them. Ronnie hesitated before breaking the news. Angela was gone. She had sold the house, moved into an apartment for a while, then disappeared. No forwarding address, no trace. It didn't make sense. The house had been paid off. She had no reason to leave. Ronnie guessed it had something to do with the restraining order, the one that barred me from contacting her or coming near her home. Maybe she was afraid. Maybe she had just wanted to erase me completely from her life. I didn't care about the reasons. I just wanted to know where my kids were. I told Ronnie to find them, then send him away. I needed time to think. He ordered me some food, went over the cottage details, and left me to my first real night of freedom. I spent it with a bottle of scotch. By morning, I regretted that decision. The pounding in my head was relentless, and the last thing I wanted was company. But the moment I tried to bury myself under the covers, I heard a voice, cheerful, relentless, and coming straight toward my bedroom. Before I could react, the blanket was ripped away, and a woman placed a tray of food beside me. Sunlight flooded the room as she threw open the curtains. Her name was Jenny, my housekeeper, and she had no patience for my hangover. Before I could protest, she shoved a glass of something foul-tasting into my hands and practically forced me to drink it. Some family remedy, she claimed. It burned all the way down. She had already made up her mind about me. She didn't believe for a second that I had liquidated Mary Simmons. More than that, she was sure I had never even been involved with her. Jenny had worked as a janitor at the tennis club Mary had been a member of. She had seen firsthand the kind of men Mary preferred. Young, good-looking, and often more than one at a time. Not someone like me. Jenny and a few others had even told the police what they knew, but it had been ignored. The story of a murdered socialite tangled up with a businessman was a better headline than one that involved underage boys. The authorities had needed someone to pin it on. I'd been convenient. But Jenny wasn't just here to talk. When I finished eating, I called for her, expecting her to take the tray. Instead, she walked back in completely without clothes, confident, unapologetic. She had taken the job knowing exactly who I was, and she had no interest in playing the role of a traditional housekeeper. She wasn't shy about her motives either. Her ex-husband had cheated on her, and she was making sure he paid for it in her own way. When she had heard I had been locked up for 7 years without a woman, she had decided she was going to be the one to fix that. Ronnie, of course, had no idea. This was her own decision, one she seemed eager to act on. And after 7 years in a cage, I wasn't about to argue. When Jenny was done, she lingered a bit longer, teasing what she called the main event. She led me to the bathroom, where she had prepared a surprise, a jacuzzi tub already filled and waiting. She had always wanted to try one, she said, and that morning she got her wish. I had never had closeness underwater before. Not something I'd go out of my way to repeat if a decent bed had been available, but it was different, and Jenny was relentless. After lunch, we spent the rest of the day together, until she finally decided it was time to head home to her unsuspecting husband. He was a fool, I thought. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but Jenny had been an unexpected gift. She told me I could have her any time, no strings attached, as long as I kept it a secret. I had no problem agreeing to that. That evening, I went to the village pub for a steak and a beer. Jenny had said the food was good, and she was right. While I ate, I caught sight of the bartender she had caught sleeping with her husband. One look at her, and I knew Jenny's husband was even more of an idiot than I had thought. She was a cheap, small-town girl with zero appeal. I wouldn't go near her if my life depended on it. The next morning, I woke to what I thought was a dream, only to realize Jenny was already up, vacuuming the cottage. After breakfast, we repeated the previous day's routine, only this time in the shower instead of the jacuzzi. Apparently, neither of us had been too thrilled about underwater closeness, but we still had our fun. At lunch, she stood at the sink washing dishes, giving me a playful wink. I had work to do, but Jenny had other ideas. When she lifted the back of her skirt to show she wasn't wearing anything underneath, my resolve vanished. A few moments later, she was bent over the kitchen table, and I was giving in to her insatiable appetite once again. When we were done, she casually mentioned that a woman had been sitting in a car down the road watching the house. Brunette, small white car, Helen Caffrey. That meant she'd been poking around the village even before my release. She wasn't just curious. She was waiting for me. Jenny had seen her in town a few days ago and had already pieced together details I hadn't noticed. Helen had been married, had at least 2 kids, and had likely gone back to her maiden name after a divorce. Sharp as ever, Jenny had caught the faint outline of a wedding ring on her finger and had seen 2 child seats in the back of her car. I planned to call Helen, but Jenny had another idea. She wanted to surprise her, throw her off balance. I let her. By the time I came downstairs, Jenny was already giving Helen a tour of the living room, making casual small talk. She left to make tea while I took a seat across from my uninvited guest. Helen got straight to the point. She wanted to hear my version of events. She had already figured out where I lived, so following me hadn't been difficult. I agreed to talk. At the time of Mary Simmons' murder, I had been running a recruitment agency. My wife Angela stayed home with our 2 kids. I knew Bill and Mary Simmons through business. Mary's company sometimes hired me to find staff. Angela and I had dined with them a few times, but never became close. They weren't our kind of people, too arrogant. Angela, in particular, didn't like Bill. She once told me he had a way of looking at her that made her uncomfortable, like he was undressing her with his eyes. After that, we avoided socializing with them. Then, one morning, I heard on the news that Mary had been found dead in a hotel room. It was surprising, but didn't seem like a big deal at the time. The hotel was near her house, and she didn't strike me as the type to be sneaking around. Angela and I discussed it briefly, as anyone would when hearing about a murder involving someone they knew, and then moved on. A few days later, that all changed. The police showed up at my house at dawn, kicked in the door, arrested me for Mary's murder. They had a search warrant for my home and office, and they claimed to have found overwhelming evidence tying me to her. Hotel receipts, matchbooks from the same hotel, my fingerprints on a champagne bottle in her room. A hotel employee swore he had delivered a bottle of champagne and had seen me with her. The receipt for the bottle, they claimed, was in my jacket pocket. My car's license plate was logged at the hotel's parking lot, but the employee who claimed to have seen me couldn't describe my car. He had only written down the plate number. Even I had to admit, it looked bad. Helen asked if I had an alibi. I didn't. That night, I had been alone in my office preparing payroll. My staff had seen me working late, but that didn't prove I hadn't left, committed murder, and returned. She asked if I had any idea how the evidence had ended up in my pockets. The answer was simple. The police planted it. Helen hesitated. She found it hard to believe the cops would go that far. But if not them, then who? She had a theory I wasn't ready to hear. Angela. She suggested my wife had set me up. I shut that down immediately. Angela had no reason to do something like that. Helen asked where Angela and the kids were now. I had no answer. She had disappeared. I had said things I regretted when she filed for divorce, and she probably thought I was dangerous. But that didn't mean she had framed me. Helen kept pressing. Why had I been doing payroll so late that night? Angela had arranged an interview for us at the best school in the city. The parents had to attend, so I had stayed late at the office to finish work in time for the meeting. Helen called that into question. The interview had been planned months in advance, not something Angela had set up at the last minute. She produced a document from the school's headmistress confirming this. Then she laid down a photograph. Bill Simmons, then another. More blurry surveillance footage. Bill again, but this time near Angela's old apartment. Helen pointed out something chilling. The child holding Bill's hand in one of the images looked like my eldest daughter. And the woman at the door of the store? Angela. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Bill Simmons had been a regular visitor at Angela's apartment. There were no security cameras inside, but the building's doorman had recognized Bill immediately. He had spent the night there often. I sat in stunned silence. Angela had always claimed to dislike Bill. She had said he made her uncomfortable, but maybe that had been a lie, a cover to keep me from suspecting anything. Jenny chimed in, offering a blunt truth. Angela might have played me all along. Pretending to be wary of Bill had kept me from inviting the Simmonses over too often. It gave her and Bill the space they needed to be together without me getting suspicious. Helen agreed. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Angela had planted the evidence. She had made sure my alibi wouldn't hold up. She had been the one to hand me over as a scapegoat. But she hadn't been the mastermind. That was Bill. Bill had the most to gain, the money, the freedom, the perfect setup. Angela had just helped him pull it off. I looked at Helen. How long have you known? I asked, anger rising in my voice. She didn't flinch. For about a month, she admitted. I started digging after my father's death. But it wasn't until I realized Angela had vanished that I put the pieces together. Jenny placed a calming hand on my arm. Don't shoot the messenger, John, she said quietly. I clenched my fists. Angela had betrayed me. Bill had framed me, and I had wasted 7 years behind bars for a crime I didn't commit. But I wasn't planning on letting them get away with it. Bill Simmons had disappeared without a trace, and Angela's sudden vanishing act only confirmed my suspicions. When I showed Simmons' photo around Angela's old building, nearly everyone recognized him. He had been a regular presence there. Pacing the room, I struggled to accept the truth. Angela, the woman I had once trusted completely, had betrayed me. She hadn't just been involved with Simmons. She had helped frame me for Mary's murder. The realization hit hard, but then another memory surfaced. 4 months before Mary's death, Angela had insisted we celebrate our anniversary with champagne. I had never liked champagne, but she had handed me the bottle to open. That same bottle had been found in Mary's hotel room. It was clear now. Angela had been planting evidence against me long before the crime even happened. The setup had been in motion for months. Helen and Jenny helped me piece it together, but proving it was another matter. Simmons had an airtight alibi, and there was no clear alternative suspect. It was possible he had hired someone, but there was no obvious connection to a hitman. The only person we knew had lied was the hotel waiter who had claimed to see me in Mary's room. If I hadn't been there, then he had either witnessed the real murderer or had been paid to lie. Helen had already looked into him. Curtis had left his hotel job shortly after my conviction. 3 months later, he bought a brand new Mercedes, paid in cash. It was far more money than a waiter could ever earn. The theory shifted. Maybe Curtis had been more than a witness. Mary had a known preference for much younger men, and back then, Curtis had been barely out of his teens. He could have been used as bait, luring her into the room, making the arrangements. But he wasn't the type to have carried out the murder himself. Helen turned her focus to another suspect, the hotel's night manager. He had claimed to be on duty at the front desk all evening, yet hadn't seen me enter or leave. If he had been lying, then he too was hiding something. I was eager to track down Curtis myself, but Helen warned against it. If I lost control, I could end up right back in prison. Instead, she had contacts who could handle it. One of them being Inspector Harris, the same officer who had helped put me away. The idea made my blood boil, but Helen insisted Harris and his partner, Sergeant Frank, had been furious when they realized I had likely been framed. They had even tried to visit me in prison, but I had refused to see them. Now, they were investigating the case, but they needed solid proof. Without the real butcher, they had no way of overturning my conviction. I had no choice but to cooperate. To shift the mood, Jenny gave Helen a tour of the cottage. I had been there for 2 days and hadn't even explored the property. The garden was massive, with a long rose-covered archway leading to a secluded courtyard. Helen admired the space, mentioning her daughters would love it. That was the first time I'd learned she had kids, 2 girls, 6 and 8. Her ex-mother-in-law helped take care of them since she worked long hours. Her marriage had ended when her husband cheated, and she had made sure he regretted it. The details amused me. She had knocked him out cold in a hotel room, sending his mistress running for cover. Jenny left for the night, suggesting Helen and I grab dinner. We went to the local pub, where I had steak again while she ordered pasta. Afterward, she headed home, and I stayed at the bar, ignoring the bartender's attempts to catch my attention. The next morning, Jenny woke me up early, shaking my shoulder. The police had arrived. Inspector Harris was waiting downstairs. Jenny left the room with a knowing smile while I dragged myself out of bed. The pounding in my head was a clear sign I had overdone it with the drinking. I barely remembered getting home. Swearing to cut back on alcohol, I downed Jenny's vile-tasting hangover cure, already making a mental note to ask her for the recipe. It was awful, but it worked. Downstairs, Jenny casually informed me that the police were waiting outside. Without a warrant or probable cause, they had no right to enter unless invited, and she had made sure they knew it. She had grown up knowing exactly what the police could and couldn't do. Her father's history with them had taught her well. Inspector Gary Harris and his sergeant, Frank Stevens, stepped inside. Harris, once responsible for putting me behind bars, now seemed almost apologetic. Helen's investigation had changed things. He admitted there was reason to question my conviction, though he still wasn't ready to declare me innocent. Instead, he focused on something more urgent. Angela and the kids had disappeared, and their safety was now a real concern. If Bill Simmons had liquidated his wife and Angela had helped frame me, then she knew far too much. With my release, Simmons might see her as a liability. If he had liquidated once for money, there was nothing stopping him from doing it again to protect himself. Panic hit me like a gut punch. Angela may have betrayed me, but she was still the mother of my children. I demanded to know what they were doing to find them. Harris assured me that airports and ports had been checked, and they were confident Angela hadn't left the country. But that didn't mean Simmons wouldn't liquidate her before she ever got the chance to run. Stevens pointed out that Simmons had to be living nearby when he was visiting Angela. If they found where he had been staying, They would likely find her and the kids too. There wasn't much I could do. They already had all the information I could offer, but they had a plan, and it involved me. Curtis, the former hotel waiter who had testified against me, was now the weak link in Simmons' cover-up. He had been paid off, but if he started talking, the entire case could unravel. Harris and Stevens suspected he had been involved in more than just perjury. The man had been linked to stolen cars, and they believed he had used one in a hit-and-run to liquidate Helen's father. Sheila Thomas, a key witness from my trial, had died in the same way. If she had been Angela's alibi, then she had likely been silenced. They wanted to make Curtis nervous enough to slip up. The idea was to let him think I was after him, angry, unpredictable, and out for revenge. If he panicked, he might make a move that would expose him. That's when they dropped the real bombshell. They expected him to try and liquidate me. The idea was insane. Curtis had always been a coward, but Harris and Stevens were convinced he had liquidated before, just not with his own hands. He had a pattern using stolen cars to do his dirty work. Jenny, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. She didn't like the plan. She knew I wanted payback, but putting myself in the open as bait felt reckless. I wasn't a fan of the idea either, but the alternative, going after Curtis myself, would only land me back in prison. The plan was set. If Curtis took the bait, he'd make his move soon. They would be watching him, ready to act. Then Jenny did something unexpected. She volunteered to help. She wanted a room in the same hotel, insisting that Curtis would recognize undercover cops but wouldn't suspect her. From the look on her face, there was no arguing with her. Once she made up her mind, there was no stopping her. 2 days later, Jenny and I checked into separate but adjoining hotel rooms near Curtis's house. The undercover officers watching over me were obvious, but that was part of the plan. We wanted Curtis to notice them. That evening, Curtis arrived in his Mercedes to chauffeur a couple to the hotel restaurant. I stood outside, casually smoking a cigar, pretending not to notice him. Jenny, watching from inside, later told me he had recognized me immediately. His reaction was unmistakable. If looks could liquidate, I'd be dead. When he returned to pick up his clients, I made sure to stare directly at him as he opened the car door. He tried to ignore me, but I could see his tension. The idea was for him to think my presence was just a coincidence, but we also planted a subtle hint. One of the clients would later mention that I was interested in hiring a chauffeur. Back in my room, Jenny entered through the adjoining door, bringing one of the officers with her. They confirmed Curtis had definitely spotted me. When the officer left, Jenny stayed behind. She had no intention of going home that night. The next morning, Helen arrived as I was finishing breakfast. We went over the next step. Curtis had a predictable routine. He jogged, had breakfast at a cafe, then returned home. I would make sure to be outside his office when he got back, letting him see me again before heading back to the hotel. At 9:30, I leaned against my car, pretending to check the engine. Curtis appeared, glancing at me repeatedly as he made his way inside. He kept watching from the window, clearly uneasy. I delayed my departure to keep him on edge, finally returning to the hotel around 9:15. The moment I got back, Bert, one of the officers, informed me that someone, likely Curtis, had called the front desk to confirm I was staying there. The receptionist, who was actually Bert's partner, had made sure Curtis got his answer. We wanted him to think he had the upper hand. Shortly after, Bert's phone rang. Curtis had left town immediately after I returned to the hotel. He had lingered just long enough to make sure I was really back before speeding off toward London. Harris suspected he was heading straight to Simmons. For the next 2 hours, we heard nothing. Bert kept watch downstairs while Helen and I talked. She opened up about her past, detailing how she discovered her husband's affair. We were still deep in conversation when Bert took another call, this time with bad news. The officers tailing Curtis had lost him in Richmond's confusing one-way system. They were certain he was heading toward Simmons' hideout, but now they had no way of knowing exactly where. Helen warned me not to ask how Harris and his team had obtained certain information. They had bent the rules, and if they got caught, they'd be in serious trouble. I didn't doubt it. The idea of Harris playing outside the law was almost amusing, but Helen insisted he was determined to make things right. The rest of the day dragged on. Despite Helen's company, I couldn't shake the frustration of feeling powerless. We spent hours watching TV and drinking coffee. By early evening, just as we were discussing dinner, Jenny and Bert walked in with an update. Curtis's car had been found near Twickenham Station, but he wasn't in it. Around the same time, another vehicle had been stolen from a parking lot in Richmond, just 2 train stops away. That stolen car had now appeared near our hotel. Harris believed Curtis or one of Simmons's men was nearby, watching, waiting for me to step out alone. I saw an opportunity. If Curtis had taken the bait, he was likely planning to run me down, just as he had done with Helen's father. But unless he actually attempted it, we had nothing to prove his intent. Jenny and Helen immediately protested. It was too risky. Bert wasn't thrilled about it either. Harris initially refused, but after a long argument, he finally gave in. If Curtis was going to make a move, we had to let him. That evening, I skipped dinner at the hotel with Helen. Instead, I walked alone to the White Hart, a pub a quarter of a mile away. If Curtis was waiting, I wanted to make sure he had his chance. Bert and his partner were supposed to keep watch outside the pub while I sat inside, but when they arrived, Jenny was with them. We pretended not to know each other and sat apart. The bar was crowded, and a few strangers joined my table throughout the evening. One guy even struck up a conversation, but nothing suspicious happened. By 11 p.m., the pub was closing, and Harris still hadn't called to report any movement. Frustrated, I stepped into the restroom and called him myself. He told me to head back to the hotel. Nothing was happening. As I exited, I noticed Bert on the phone. Our eyes met briefly, and I knew. He was telling Harris I was on my way. We couldn't openly communicate in case anyone was watching. Bert, Jenny, and his partner left the bar before me. I walked back alone along an empty sidewalk, and about 50 yards in, I heard an engine start. At first, I assumed it was Bert's car, but something felt off. Then I realized the sound was too close, and the vehicle wasn't reversing. Bert would have needed to back out of the parking lot. This car was coming straight toward me. A horn blared in the distance. Bert had spotted the car too. I spun around just as a vehicle with its headlights off jumped the curb, heading directly for me. I had nowhere to run. A solid brick wall loomed beside me. No doors, no alleyways. Just me and a speeding car with no intention of stopping. Adrenaline slowed everything. The car rushed toward me, but I couldn't see the driver. It was too dark. I considered diving to the side, but it was useless. The driver could swerve or reverse to finish the job. Then, out of nowhere, I jumped. My memory blurred. But I think I planted one foot on the hood to push off. The impact spun me in the air. My shoulder clipped the roof, my body rolled sideways, and I hit the trunk before crashing onto the pavement. The next thing I knew, Jenny was kneeling over me, her face filled with worry. My body ached, but I could move my fingers and toes. My shoulder throbbed, likely from slamming into the car, but nothing seemed broken. Bert and his partner had chased the vehicle. An ambulance arrived, but I insisted I didn't need it. Jenny disagreed. She said I'd been unconscious for 5 minutes. I barely remembered the ride to the hospital. Once there, doctors poked, prodded, and scanned me endlessly. The final diagnosis, a mild concussion, along with a few scrapes and bruises. When I finally regained full awareness, I asked Jenny what had happened. She explained that Harris had been right. Curtis's car hadn't moved. This was a completely different vehicle, and now nearly every available officer was searching for it. And they had lost it. The car disappeared before Bert even made it out of the parking lot. Helen, who had been quiet until then, sat beside me holding my hand. I only realized it when I tried to scratch my nose and found both my hands occupied. One by Jenny, the other by Helen. The dilemma was ridiculous. I chose to let my nose itch. A doctor entered, instructing the women to leave. Rest was the best treatment, and they planned to sedate me. I found it absurd that they didn't even ask if I wanted the sedative, but apparently I wasn't in a state to argue. Later, I learned I had been far more out of it than I thought, insisting I was fine and demanding to leave. That night was restless. The steady beeping of machines irritated me, and at some point I overheard voices, Helen and Jenny pressing Harris for answers. A nurse eventually hushed them, and silence returned. My sleep was plagued by strange dreams, of the car barreling toward me, of trying to see the driver's face but failing. In another, my hospital bed was moving, surrounded by flashing lights and buzzing sounds. I couldn't open my eyes, but I felt myself being transported. When I finally woke up, I was in a different hospital room, and right in front of me was the most impressive pair of bosoms I had seen in years, neatly framed by a nurse's uniform. Considering my past 7 years in prison, it wasn't a bad way to wake up. The nurse was adjusting something above my bed, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, maybe lingering medication, maybe pure impulse, I leaned forward and playfully bit her. She yelped and jumped back. Jenny's voice came from across the room just as the nurse stepped aside, revealing Helen sitting in a chair nearby. Bad timing. Helen, unimpressed, pointed out that while two women were genuinely worried about me, I had chosen to bite a third. The nurse laughed, saying most patients tried grabbing, not biting. Jenny, ever the troublemaker, suggested warning the staff to be careful around me. Helen finally asked how I was feeling. Like hell. She told me I'd been unconscious for over a week due to brain swelling. I turned to Jenny, who was now making exaggerated faces at me, glancing toward Helen as if trying to send some kind of signal. I had no idea what she was hinting at, but given my current state, I wasn't in the mood to figure it out. The doctor insisted I stay another day or two for observation before being discharged. Helen and Jenny returned shortly after he left, bringing Ronnie with them. As expected, Ronnie was furious about my involvement in the police operation, already calculating how much we could sue for. But I shut that down immediately. It had been partly my idea, and blaming the police wouldn't change anything. Helen updated me on the investigation. The car that hit me had been found burned, just like the others. Harris believed the stolen Ford Mondeo was a deliberate distraction, pulling police attention away while the real attack vehicle, stolen weeks before my release, was used against me. They had even caught it on highway cameras the morning I walked free, leading to speculation that the original plan was to target me right outside the prison. That never happened, likely because of the swarm of reporters at the gates. For now, I remained in a private hospital unit under armed guard, thanks to Harris. The alias, Mr. Smith, had been Jenny's doing, first to keep the press at bay, and later to keep Simmons from tracking me down. Meanwhile, Curtis had an alibi. He was under police surveillance during the attempt on my life. But the police were convinced he had stolen the Mondeo that night, meaning he had known about the hit. Despite being questioned, he showed no reaction and even denied seeing me outside his office. It was possible he had coordinated with Simmons using an untraceable burner phone, but tracking his registered number yielded nothing useful. The next morning, Harris and Frank confirmed that Simmons, Angela, and my children were still missing. Making them public fugitives wasn't an option. No one could predict how Simmons would react. I suggested setting another trap, this time on my terms. Harris immediately rejected the idea, but I argued that Simmons had been planning to eliminate me for weeks. I refused to spend my life looking over my shoulder. After some debate, Harris agreed, but with conditions. Security would remain in place, and they installed panic buttons at the cottage, though I had no plans to return there. Once they left, I finally turned my attention to Jenny, realizing she had been by my side the entire time. Her husband was no longer a concern. She had walked in on him with the bartender from the Rose and Crown. Now, she had moved into a spare room at the cottage with Helen's help, and I assured her that was fine. Later, Ronnie arrived, and I gave him a list of tasks. I needed $5,000 in cash, a new car, and a legal document ensuring that if anything happened to me, my assets, though hidden, would be divided between Jenny, Helen, and my kids. Angela wouldn't see a dime. Ronnie also made some calls on a secure line, knowing exactly what I meant without further explanation. 3 days later, I was discharged. Instead of leaving through the front, I was smuggled out through a laundry van. The police insisted no one was watching the hospital, but I wasn't taking any chances. Helen and Jenny picked me up at a prearranged spot and took me to a luxury hotel. That night, I met with 3 men from my past, contacts from prison who were now on the outside. Over drinks, we devised a plan. They would pose as clients, hiring Curtis as a chauffeur, then take him to an isolated warehouse in East London for a private conversation. One of them mentioned a doorway over the river, perfect for intimidation. The way they discussed it so casually made it clear they had experience in these matters. One even complained about bodies being dumped in the Thames, saying the tides dragged them back and forth too long. He was more concerned about river pollution than the crime itself. The night stretched into the early morning, ending only when the alcohol ran out. By morning, I needed one of Jenny's infamous hangover cures. She took one look at the empty bottles, shook her head, and mixed something awful but effective. After forcing me to eat, she decided I needed a shower, which nearly liquidated me. Her idea of helping involved an exhausting level of enthusiasm. Later, she casually mentioned that Helen was bringing her daughters to dinner. It wasn't just a meal, it was an introduction. Jenny made it clear she believed Helen had feelings for me and that I should pay attention. Helen arrived at 7:30 with her daughters, and before dinner we took a walk around the hotel grounds. The girls were polite, but clearly unused to such a setting. Neither was I. To lighten the mood, I entertained them by teasing the overly formal waiter. The girls giggled, and Helen gave me a familiar look, the same one Angela used to give me when I played with our own kids in public. Jenny had prepared gifts for the children, knowing first impressions mattered. Among them, she had tucked in an extra box containing a brooch for Helen, something Helen had admired while shopping. Jenny had taken note, quietly making sure she got it. The message was clear. Helen mattered to her. And whether I admitted it or not, she was starting to matter to me too. The dinner had been an unspoken test, an introduction of sorts to see how Helen's daughters reacted to me. After they left, Jenny, pleased with how the evening had gone, insisted we celebrate at the bar. She was certain the kids liked me, playfully calling me Superman for the way I had dodged the car. The night stretched late, and at some point, it became clear that Jenny had no plans to leave. The hours blurred between sleep and moments of activity, and it was mid-morning when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Jenny wanted to come along, but I refused. I wasn't dragging her into this. The drive to the warehouse took nearly 2 hours. Upon arrival, I was led inside through a series of connected buildings until we reached one by the river. Curtis's Mercedes sat abandoned in the middle of the space. He had been here all night. Inside a small office, my contact briefed me. Curtis had been locked in the trunk for hours while the crew casually discussed ways to dispose of him, ensuring he was terrified before they even started questioning him. He was rattled, confused, and already broken before the first question was asked. The plan was simple: make Curtis believe they weren't after Simmons, but after me. If he thought these men had no interest in Bill Simmons, he might accidentally reveal where Simmons was hiding, hoping to shift attention away from himself. They dragged him from the trunk, and the first few questions were met with obvious lies. He claimed he hadn't seen me in years. Well-placed punch to the gut changed that. Fear had a way of making people talk, and Curtis was no exception. He admitted he assumed I was hunting him for testifying against me, but the story didn't hold up. If I truly wanted revenge, he would have been dead already. Under pressure, he finally slipped. He claimed I was looking for my woman, revealing he knew Angela had left with Simmons. That wasn't widely known information, which meant he was closer to Simmons than he had let on. As the threats intensified, Curtis panicked, his eyes darting between the men surrounding him. When a crowbar appeared, he lost whatever composure he had left. He confessed that Simmons had been hiding somewhere near Southampton. Simmons regularly had Curtis steal cars and leave them there, always picking them up himself. Payments arrived by mail, postmarked from Southampton, hidden inside cassette cases or sealed envelopes. It was clear he had been living in the area for some time. Under further questioning, Curtis revealed a bigger secret. He had played a role in framing me for Mary Simmons' murder. He had stolen a bottle of champagne and glasses from the hotel, handing them off to Simmons. Somehow, Simmons had planted my fingerprints on them before placing them in his wife's room. Since Mary always ordered champagne for her meetings, it hadn't seemed out of place. Curtis had been the one to deliver it that night, and later testified that he saw me there. I pressed further. Had he seen anyone else in her room? He hesitated before admitting that while he hadn't, someone could have been hiding in the bathroom. The room she always used had a fire escape directly outside. He suspected that was how her lovers came and went unseen. The information was unsettling, but it confirmed my suspicions. Simmons had orchestrated everything from the start. As Curtis slumped in the chair, out of breath and drained, my contact gave me a questioning glance, waiting to see if I had more to ask. But my mind was elsewhere. A buried memory surfaced. Angela's aunt had owned a house on the outskirts of the New Forest, not far from Southampton. If Simmons was hiding, that might be where he had taken Angela and my children. I'd only been to Angela's aunt's house once, but I remembered enough to place it. Isolated, no neighbors, the perfect hideout. If the old woman had passed away, Angela might have inherited it, making it an ideal place for Simmons to lay low. It was also conveniently close to Southampton. My contact must have noticed the shift in my expression. He asked if I'd remembered something. I told him I had a lead, but I wasn't calling the police just yet. If Simmons was there and felt trapped, he could take my kids hostage or worse. I needed to see the situation before things spiraled out of control. Curtis, still terrified, had been locked back in his car trunk to ensure he wouldn't warn Simmons. I agreed to keep it that way until I confirmed my suspicions, but I wasn't going alone. 2 of my guys insisted on coming as backup. By the time I reached Winchester, I called Harris, letting him know where I was headed. He wasn't happy and told me not to do anything reckless, but I had already gained an hour on him. He and Frank were chasing me down, but they didn't know what car I was driving and couldn't alert local police without tipping off Simmons. We parked a mile from the house and waited for nightfall. I shut off my phone to avoid being tracked. My backup, far more patient than me, drank from a flask and reminded me that waiting was part of the game. Approaching the house, it looked deserted. I eased the door open, just enough to peek inside. The room appeared empty at first glance, but just as I caught sight of a motionless foot on the floor, something struck the back of my head, and everything went dark. When I came to, I was lying inside the very room I had been trying to enter. Pain throbbed through my skull, but a worse realization settled in. I wasn't alone. A few feet away, sprawled on the floor, was Bill Simmons, dead. Angela's voice cut through the fog in my mind. She was sitting across the room, a tool in her hand, completely composed. She explained her plan, almost casually. To the police, it would look like I'd broken in, seeking revenge for her betrayal. She would tell them I had fired at Simmons first, but in a panic she had grabbed a tool and liquidated me in self-defense. A tragic story. A frightened ex-wife forced to defend herself against a violent, jealous husband. It wasn't how she originally planned things, but the outcome suited her just fine. 2 problems eliminated at once. That's when I realized what had been nagging me: the kids. I demanded to know where they were. Angela assured me they were safe, tucked away at a boarding school in Kent, far from this mess. She was confident she'd get away with it. The tool, an automatic, was a type she had no known experience with, adding to the illusion of a desperate woman firing in fear. She had even planned to shoot a few rounds randomly around the room to make the scene look believable. What baffled me most was why she had gone to such extremes in the first place. If she and Simmons wanted to be together, why not just leave? But the truth was simpler and colder. It had never been about Simmons. He was just a means to an end. Angela wanted money, marry Simmons' fortune, my assets, everything. Framing me had been step 1, but I hadn't been worth eliminating because thanks to my offshore investments, she wouldn't have been able to access my money. Simmons, on the other hand, had access to Mary's wealth, and once his wife was out of the way, Angela had her hands on it all. She admitted she had even considered taking out a large insurance policy on me, but it would have looked too suspicious. Then Simmons came along, desperate and greedy. He had nothing of his own. Everything belonged to Mary, and it hadn't taken much to convince him to help frame me. I asked if she had really liquidated Mary. Angela just smirked. The realization hit like a punch. She had done it all. Mary Simmons, Sheila Thomas, George Caffrey. Even the attempt on my life. No wonder I hadn't seen the driver. She had been low in the seat, nearly invisible. She wasn't even denying it anymore. She had played everyone. Simmons, the police, me. And now she planned to finish the job. With Simmons dead, she would have access to both his stolen wealth and whatever was left of mine. She had the account numbers, the passwords. She even waved a piece of paper in front of me, proof of her access to the fortune. She had waited for me to get out of prison because she knew eventually I would come looking for her. She hadn't wanted to spend her life constantly watching her back. Letting me find her on her terms had given her the perfect opportunity to end things permanently. As she monologued, I focused on one thing. I needed time. I could sense my backup nearby, just outside, but Angela wasn't an idiot. She was seated far from the door, tool trained on me. One wrong move, and I was dead before they could intervene. She was still talking, smug, sure of herself, but I wasn't done yet. Angela had me cornered. If I moved too fast, she'd pull the trigger without hesitation. I needed to stall, keep her talking long enough for the boss and Bernie to realize what was happening and step in. Reaching for the back of my head, I felt a lump where she'd knocked me out. I muttered something about what she had used, and she casually admitted it was a rolling pin, fitting for the helpless housewife narrative she was crafting. Then a noise outside caught her attention. That was my signal. A split second later, the window shattered as a garden bench came crashing through. Bernie and the boss had made their move. I dove behind the sofa, but not fast enough. A bullet ripped through the armrest, grazing my head. I barely felt it before everything blurred again. The next thing I remembered was hearing someone. Later, I'd learn it was Gary, shouting for Angela to drop her tool. Then, a flurry of loud blasts erupted from all directions before sudden silence. When I opened my eyes, the boss was kneeling beside me, checking my wound. It was just a scratch, but it had been close. I barely had time to register that Angela was dead before Gary spoke. He had been forced to shoot her. I knew it wasn't why he had joined the police, but he had no choice. The situation was a mess. The boss had lent Gary his own tool, knowing full well the risk. If anyone traced the tool, he'd be looking at serious prison time. But it didn't come to that. Angela had stockpiled illegal firearms, all tied to her, which made it easy for Gary to cover his tracks. The boss and Bernie slipped away before the local cops arrived. The ambulance took forever. By then, Gary, Frank, and I had pieced together our statements. It turned out that Curtis had escaped, and Marco, realizing things were unraveling, had called the boss. That's when he used my phone to contact Gary and Frank. Gary had already guessed where I was headed. Back during Angela's initial interrogation for Mary Simmons' murder, she had mentioned her only living relative was in a New Forest nursing home. When I said I was heading toward Southampton, he had put the pieces together and gone looking for me. I spent the night in the hospital, stitched up and scolded by Helen and Jenny for going after Angela and Simmons alone. We managed to keep the press at bay for a while, but once they found the cottage, they swarmed. That only made things harder when I had to retrieve my daughters from boarding school and tell them their mother was gone. Angela and Simmons had told them I was dead. That, along with their hatred for the school, made things complicated. I wouldn't have managed without Helen and Jenny, or the local police keeping the press away. The boss even provided security, which proved useful, especially once the kids started school locally. Jenny moved into the cottage, becoming a governess for both my daughters and Helen's when she visited. My conviction was overturned surprisingly fast, thanks to Gary's testimony. Curtis vanished, but Gary was confident he'd resurface. Whether he could prove Curtis was an accessory to murder remained uncertain, but he was at least wanted for perjury and obstruction of justice. By then, things had cooled between Jenny and me. Sometimes she still snuck into my room at night, but she had other prospects, namely Bert, one of the cops who had been guarding the hotel. He started showing up more, sharing coffee with her. She refused to date him until her divorce was finalized, and even then she insisted the kids had to be old enough before she'd consider marriage. She never said how old. One morning I stood by the pond holding a slip of paper, account numbers to the money Bill Simmons had hidden in Swiss banks. Mary's money. Blood money. I wondered what she would say if she knew how this had all ended. The paper felt heavier than it should, weighed down by choices yet to be made. I tucked it into my coat pocket and headed back to the house. Helen was waiting on the porch, coffee in hand, hair tousled by the wind. She gave me a knowing smile. "You're up early," she said. "Just couldn't sleep," I lied. We sat together, watching as the kids woke, their laughter filling the air. For the first time in years, things felt right. Weeks turned to months. The paper with the account numbers remained locked away in my office, safe, untouched. Helen never asked about it, but she knew. She always knew something was on my mind. One night, long after the children had fallen asleep, Helen approached me. The soft glow of the lamp outlined her face in warm shadows. "You don't have to tell me anything," she murmured. "But if this is what's keeping you awake, maybe it's time to face it." I didn't respond. How could I explain that I held a fortune, yet every dollar of it was tainted, stained with deception, violence, and fear? That night, I made a decision. The transfers started gradually, calculated and untraceable, slipping into various funds and accounts under names that didn't exist. The money didn't bring satisfaction, only a quiet sense of relief, as if shifting an unbearable weight from one shoulder to another. Helen and I moved into a larger home, a stately old house with towering windows, and a garden where roses bloomed year-round. The children settled into a good school, their laughter filling the halls as they ran through the doors each afternoon. Occasionally, my thoughts drifted to the boss. Was he still out there, still surviving in the shadows? But those musings grew rarer with time. Angela lingered only as a fleeting ghost, a distant specter from a life I'd left behind. Her schemes, her betrayals, they all faded like a dream that loses its sharpness upon waking. Life pressed forward, and step by step, we pieced it together again, steady, quiet, and unexpectedly joyful. One crisp winter morning, as snow blanketed the garden in white, Helen joined me with a cup of tea. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice gentle. I looked out at the children playing, their laughter echoing in the frosty air. "Yes," I said. "I'm happy." The sheet of paper with the Swiss account numbers remained locked away, a relic of another time. It no longer held any power over me. Life had moved on, and for once it had been generous enough to offer me a second chance.